Truth Triumphant by B.J. Wilkinson. Chapter 18. Timothy of Baghdad, the Church under Mohammedan rule. It was not from Nestorius, but from Thomas, Bartholomew, Thaddeus, and others that this people first received the knowledge of a Savior, as will be seen in the sequel. They were a strong and prosperous people before the Mohammedans overran Asia, living on the plains of Assyria, sustaining schools and colleges, whose students carried to China and throughout India probably the first message telling of that the Messiah had come. Timothy is an outstanding leader of the church in the East in connection with its great expansion throughout Asia. He belongs to the period when the Mohammedans dominated not only Persia, but also the Near East after having overthrown the Zoroastrian dominion. He is a representative of that line of patriarchs who guided the church through the centuries of Muslim power. From the time of Timothy, and even from a short while before the Church of the East took its place in the gospel and prophetic history when it was being driven into the wilderness. This is not because the Arabian rulers persecuted Christians, but because of the attitude of the papal church in the West. When the Muslim power struck low the Mithraic kings of Persia, Mohammedanism was not yet strong enough to completely oppose other religions. In many general ways, Muhammad himself felt kindly towards Christianity, especially towards the more simple believers in Jesus, such as the Assyrian Christians. When the victorious Muslim general conquered Zoroastrian Persia, the Church of the East was in the hands of a wise and able head, who secured in the following way a charter of privileges for Christians. Ishoyabu, sometimes called Jesus Bajabus, as Catholicos, or a supreme head of the Church of the East, succeeded in obtaining a pledge granting protection and freedom of worship on the Christians on the condition that the Christians paid a certain tribute. Of this, Sir E.A. Willis Budge says, "The Patriarch Ishoyabu II, who sat from 1628 to 44, seeing that the downfall of the Persian Empire was imminent, came to terms with Muhammad or Abu Bakr. The Patriarch stipulated that the Christians should be protected from the attacks of their foes, and that the Arabs should not make them go to war with them, and that they should not compel them to change their manners and laws, that they should help them repair their old churches, that the tax on the poor should not exceed 4 zuz, that the tax on the merchants and the wealthy men should not be 10 zuz per man, that a Christian woman servant should not be compelled to change her faith, nor to neglect fasting and prayer." These immunities extended by Abu Bakr were not only confirmed by Omar his successor, but even the taxes were remitted. It remained for the renowned warrior Caleb to confirm and extend the high rights and privileges which were allowed the church. The Arabs, like the Romans, were very partial to the Assyrian Christians because they found it necessary in the early days of their power to lean on the splendid schools which this church had developed. Medicine made great progress in the hands of the Church of the East. The Arabian court in its extended administrations employed its members as secretaries and imperial representatives. Justinian's grievous laws against the leaders in Asia Minor and Persia afflicted the Church of the East. He destroyed any possibility of reconciliation with the Assyrian Church when he issued the imperial condemnation of the 3 church leaders, usually called the 3 chapters. By this decree, he bitterly alienated the millions of believers in Asia without winning the malcontents. Never again would there be any general movement among the Asiatic Christians towards the religion of Rome. The year of this decree was 533. Catholicos moved to the new capital of Muslim Empire. The Mohammedans used the conquered Persian Empire as a stepping stone to further and more rapid conquest. They looked with greedy eyes upon the rich and cultured kingdoms of Central Asia. It is difficult for travelers today who behold the sandy expanse of Palestine to visualize the once mighty kingdoms of Israel and Judah that occupied those wastes. With whirling advances into those gardens of Eden, the intrepid warriors of Muhammad secured decisive victories then returned to display to the astonishing eyes dazzling riches of Traxomany Traxoyana. Extension of the dominion brought weakness of control. The rapid and unexpected victories of Islam's western armies, stretching along the southern Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean and extending northward toward Turkestan, broke the unity of the empire. Strife for preeminence came in different branches of Muhammad's progeny. Instead of one, there arose three caliphates. The one, Umayyads, was given the dynasty of the Prophet's family, which seized the power reaching from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of China. The birth of this new caliphate was the signal for the creation of a new capital. An excellent site on the Tigris River was chosen, and the city of Baghdad, which still stands today, arose in all its splendor. In 1762, with their usual foresight, the leaders of the Church of the East removed the central administration of their widely extending work to the new capital of Baghdad. They had received recognition from the Caliph as Millet, the term usually given to subject religions under Oriental monarchs. Abraham Yohanan writes that in the Arabian history of India records that for the year 1000 that the bulk of the population in Syria, Iraq, and Khorasan were Christian. He further states that the Assyrian Christians held high offices under the caliphs, or the area of government controlled by the Mohammedans. The historian Arminius Vambry notes that by 1000 the Church of the East had made greater progress in Central Asia than Mohammedan historians are willing to allow. The Catholicate of Timothy. Timothy, AD 780 to AD 824, was elected as Catholicos at a time when Charlemagne was wielding his heavy sword to advance the interests of the papacy in Europe. His election took place 12 years before the founding of Kyoto, the most famous of Japan's ancient cities. It was during the early years of his Catholicate that Japan sent Kobo Daeshi, of whom more shall be said later, to visit China and to bring about reconciliation in Japan between Buddhism and the old indigenous religion of Mikado's reign called Shintoism. In the days of Timothy, a wave of inquiry was sweeping over the minds of men in Eastern and Northeastern Asia. Literature and learning were in the hands of the Church of the East. Practically all the subjects offered in similar institutions today were taught in their colleges. Some of the lines of instructions given were science, philosophy, materia medica, medicine, astronomy, law, Bible theology, geometry, music, arithmetic, dialectics, grammar, rhetoric, Greek literature, and the Greek, Syrian, Chaldean, and Egyptian languages. Claudius Buchanan writes, "They have preserved the manuscripts of the Holy Scriptures incorrupt during a long period of ages, and have now committed them into their own hands. By their long and energetic defense of pure doctrine against anti-Christian error, they are entitled to the gratitude and thanks of the rest of the Christian world." Timothy grasped the situation with a master's hand. This unwearied worker was ever busy receiving reports from distant lands, at the same time stimulating training centers to graduate more and still more missionaries. He watched over the purity of doctrine. He was continually concentrating devoted young men that had the spirit of sacrifice, missionaries who would bring mercy into cruel hearts, and who would instill culture into repulsive peoples, and who would gather the galloping tribes of the desert around them to study the messages of the sacred word. Timothy must have been thrilled by the news from China, even though delayed because of the immense distance, that in the days of the preceding Catholicos a stone monument had been erected with imperial cooperation in Chang'an, the capital of the nation, to the triumphs of Christianity amid the yellow race. Moreover, China was then the greatest empire in the world, and its imperial center was the most thrilling city on the globe. There is a record of a letter that Timothy wrote, exulting on the news of the conversion of a king of the Turks. He states that the people have turned from idolatry, have become Christian, and have asked for that a metropolitan be consecrated and sent to guide their nation in the new faith. Their demand for a metropolitan would indicate the existence of many leaders of provincial clergy among the Turks. The request, Timothy declares, had already been granted, or as the letter recites, In these days the Holy Spirit has anointed a metropolitan for the Turks, and we are preparing to consecrate another one for the Tibetans. The making of this provision for Tibet portrays the success achieved by the Church of the East in that tableland nation. In other letters to a certain Rabban Sergius, the patriarch not only records the fact that he was preparing to consecrate a metropolitan for the inhabitants of Tibet, but also that in his time many missionaries crossed the sea and went to the Indians and the Chinese with only a rod and a script. In one of these epistles he apprises his correspondents of the death of the metropolitan of China. Thus, while Charlemagne, by strokes of his battle axe, was destroying the beautiful centers of Celtic Christianity in northwestern Europe, and while agents of Rome were laboring to resist the onward march of Scottish and Irish Christianity into England, and the church in the wilderness of the East was consecrating metropolitans to superintend spiritual leaders in China, Tibet, India, and among the nations of the Turks. Thomas of Marga, writing concerning the indefatigable labors of Timothy, tells of the appointment of 80 missionaries sent to convert the heathen of the Far East. These were bishops who preached the teaching of Christ in those countries of the Dalamanites and the Gileans, and of the rest of the savage people beyond them, and planted in them the light of the truth of the gospel of our Lord. They evangelized them, and they baptized them, worked miracles, and showed prodigies, and the news of their exploits reached to the farthest points of the East. You may learn of all these clearly from the letter which some merchants and secretaries of the kings, who had penetrated as far as there for the sake of commerce and state of affairs, wrote to the patriarch Mar Timothy. In other places, the same historian relates that about this time, Shubalisho was ordained by Timothy to evangelize the primitive people inhabiting the country beyond Central Asia. The patriarch declared that the one newly ordained for this task was fitted for it because he was versed not only in Syriac but also in Arabic and Persian. In this letter it is to be noted that the Church of the East not only brought the heathen into their faith, but also overcame a difficult task of converting heretics like the Marcionites and the Manichaeans. Thus he continues, he taught and baptized many towns and numerous villages, and brought them to the teachings of the divine life. He built churches and set them up in them priests and deacons, and singled out some brethren who were missionaries with him to teach them psalms and the canticles of the Spirit. He then himself went deep inland to the farthest end of the East in the work of the great evangelization he was doing among the pagans, Marcionites, Manichaeans, and other kinds of beliefs and abominations. And he sowed the sublime light and the teaching the gospel, the source and life of peace. By these facts, which have been well authenticated, one can have a glimpse of the tremendous activity going on in the bosom of the Assyrian Church. The work was to go on for many centuries after Timothy. Timothy may be taken as a type of the intelligent, devoted, and industrious leaders who, decade after decade throughout Asia, turned many to righteousness. In the midst of these labors, India was not forgotten. It has already been noted how Timothy sent out many missionaries to India at the same time he was sending them to China. The patriarch, Ishoyaba, who consummated the contract with the Muslim caliph for the protection of his people more than 100 years previous to Timothy, censured for misconduct the metropolitan of the southeastern Persia, who was located near the borders of northwestern India. His written rebuke bemoaned the disastrous effects of the leader's irregularities because, he says, episcopal succession has been interrupted in India, and that divine teaching by means of racial bishops had been withheld from India. In other words, the rebuke infers that throughout the whole of the Hindu peninsula, clergy, provincial directors, organized churches, and companies of Christian communities could be found. Of Timothy himself, it is recorded that while writing to the monks of Marmaran regarding the disputed words, who was crucified for us, adds, in all the countries of the sunrise, that is to say, among the Indians, the Chinese, the Tibetans, the Turks, In all the provinces under the jurisdiction of the Patriarchal See, there is no addition of the words crucified for us. Conquest of the Mongols. Mingyana quotes a letter purporting to have been written by Philoxenus. He was a famous writer attached to a smaller Eastern church, Monophysite. The document is in two parts. The second part, which is evidently the work of a later writer, outlines the introduction of Christianity among the Turks. The scope and analysis of this treatment, dealing with the nations of farther Asia, as well as the freshness of its descriptions, sheds unusual light on a region that is little known. It presents the Turks as dwelling in tents and having no towns, villages, or houses. Well organized, they live as the children of Israel did during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. These Turks had their premises well kept. While the people themselves were clean and neat in their habits, they accepted both Old and New Testaments in Syriac, although evidence indicates that they have the scriptures also in their own script. When the divine writings were used in public services, they were translated by officiating pastors in the vernacular in order that the people might understand what was being read. It was a most illuminating statement concerning these Turks to read that they were ruled by over 4 great and powerful kings, who evidently lived at quite a distance from each other. The letter applied the name of Tartar to all the divisions, and designated their country as Sarikon. This is the name known, as Migiana points out, which was given to China in the days of Christ. Each of these kings ruled over 400,000 families who accepted and obeyed the teachings and gospel of Christ. If each family was composed of an average of 5 persons, it would mean that the 4 kingdoms had a population of about 8 million, and they were all Christians. From the 27 grand divisions of the church administration covering the Orient, communications were sent not only concerning the new religious developments, but also about events of international importance. Thus, in the year 1009, Abdisho, Metropolitan of Merv, the church director in the powerful province of Khurasan, northeastern Persia, wrote to the Patriarch John, informing him that 200,000 Turks and Mongolians had embraced Christianity. He pointed out that the conversion occurred because the king of Karates, which people spread over the region around Lake Baikal, Siberia, had been found wandering in the high mountains where he had been overtaken by a violent snowstorm. In his hopelessness, he considered himself lost, and dreamed or thought that he saw a giant appear to him in vision, saying, "If you will accept Christ, I will lead you to safety." Having promised to become a Christian and having returned safely to his kingdom, he sought out Christian merchants who were traveling amongst his tribes and learned from them the way of salvation. Mention should be made here of the name of the presbyter John, stories of whom stirred medieval Europe. Reports came through the West of a powerful Christian king who, in the depths of Scythia, ruled over a mighty people. He is known variously by names: Presbyter John, Priest John. Some think he was the king of the Karats, and others believe that, in addition to being a great king himself, he was also the son-in-law to the king of the powerful Karakatai. Pictures of these nations with their dreaded kings, all or nearly all of whom had been brought to Christ, confirms the opinion expressed by Migiana that the Church of the East was by far the greatest missionary church the Christian cause had produced. In following its evangelical conquest, one ranges through Turkestan, Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, and Tibet. One is introduced to the sketches of territory more vast than would be possible to visualize in any other quarter of the globe. One becomes interested in and familiarized with people and portions of the Earth's nation which previously had no claim on any man's attention. Truly, the church in the wilderness was a wonderful missionary church. Conquests of Genghis Khan. "12 centuries of ever-widening spiritual conquest were not accomplished any too soon by the Church of the East. The fierce energy of the countless tribes of Mongolia and Siberia, stirred by the new ideas heard from the lips of missionaries, was beginning to display itself as a world menace. These hordes needed only a leader possessing the caliber of Julius Caesar's to go forth on conquest, never halting until Germany, France, and England trembled before the next blow. In the beginning of the 13th century, that leader appeared. His name was Genghis, a chief of the Mongols. After his first victories over the surrounding tribes of Siberia, he took the title of Khan, or king. How Genghis Khan conquered all of Asia, and how he and his son Ughotai devastated Central Europe, and how the Pope started up in an alarm at the report of this news and sought to utilize the influence of the Church of the East to save the Catholic nations in the West, is a story of great significance. The name Mongol for 2 centuries after Genghis Khan was the terror of Central Asia, yet the origin of this tribe is in obscurity. Numerically, it is not the largest of the Tartary kingdoms. Genghis became a warlike father and mother, but was left fatherless when he was only 13 years of age. His mother resolutely resumed the reins of the kingdom and regained supremacy over half the revolting chiefs. Later, Genghis brought all the rebels back into subjection and began successful conquest of the nearby kingdoms of the Karets, Mirkits, Uyghurs, and Namians. The immense victories won by Genghis in China were the result of much strategy as well as prowess. He possessed skillful ability in coordinating massive bodies of troops spread over wide areas, aiming at separate points of conquest. He was tolerant of religion. He treated Christianity, Buddhism, Mohammedanism, and other faiths with impartiality. Some authorities say he killed them all alike as if they were in the way of his conquest, or were in the cities doomed to destruction. Abu Farja writes of him that he commanded the scribes of the Uyghurs, and they taught the children of the Tartars their books. He was a lawgiver of the highest order, creating for the people over whom he ruled a code of regulations which later conquerors were glad to adopt. Fortified by his victories in Siberia, Mongolia, and China, he turned his attention to new successes in Western Asia and Eastern Europe. Of the ruin wrought by Genghis Khan, Arminius Vambery writes, though already 70 years of old, the Genghis once more took the field against Tangut, which had rebelled against him. But he died during his campaign in the year 624, 1226, leaving behind him all traces throughout Asia of the fire and the sword which his love of war had devastated the whole continent, but nowhere so deeply marked as in Traxania, where the civilization of centuries had been destroyed, and the people plunged into a depth of barbarism in which the remembrance of their former greatness and their whole future were alike engulfed. No part of Asia suffered so severely from the incursions of the Mongolian hordes as the countries belonging on the border of Oxus and the Yaxartes. No wonder then that within 5 short years the great roads of Central Asia, by which the products of China and India were conveyed to Western Asia and Europe, were deserted. That the oases, well known for their fertility, lay barren and neglected, or finally that the trade in arms and jewelry and silk and enamels, so celebrated throughout Islam, decayed forever. The towns were in ruins, the peasants either murdered or compulsorily enrolled in the Mongolian army, and the artisans sent off by the thousands to the farthest east to adorn and beautify the homes of the conquerors. Bokhara and Samarkand never again regained their former mental activity, and their intellectual labors were henceforth entirely devoted to casuistry, mysticism, and false religion. At the time Russia was conquered, it consisted of many small independent states, constantly at war with one another and nominally under the common suzerainty of a grand prince or czar. All the cities ravaged by the armies of Genghis were so completely obliterated from the sight of man that the Mongol chieftain could say, as he had said many times to his fallen foe, that he was the scourge of God. Thus, while his armies were in subduing the northern Chinese empires in the east, and other armies of the Mongols were conquering the northwestern part of India, Genghis Khan was also laying west to a part of Russia and attacking the upper Volga. Death overtook him while in his warfare. He was not a persecutor of Christianity. It is stated that one of his wives, a Karet by birth and a near relative of the Presbyter John, was a Christian. He bequeathed his vast empire, reaching from China all the way to Hungary and Poland, to his 3 sons. One of the 3, Ogotai, was chosen as the king of kings to succeed his father. Koyuk spares Europe. It was the terrible wars waged by Ogotai which brought home to the nations of Europe the threat of the subjection to the Mongol. Batu, the intrepid and invincible general of Ogotai, suddenly appeared on the eastern flanks of Poland and Hungary. Hungary had been relied upon to check the Mongols, but unexpectedly it offered comparatively feeble resistance, and for a number of years the forces of the Tartars passed and repassed over her lands, pillaging, ravaging, and devastating. Only the Holy Roman Empire now lay between the conquerors on the east and France and England on the west. Ogotai died in the year 1241. The princes were recalled from the war to select a new Khan. While they were coming together, the Queen Mother labored earnestly for the election of her favorite son, Koyuk, and her work resulted in his election. Koyuk was a true Christian, and in his days the prestige of numerous Christians in his dominion was very high. Mingyana relates that his camp was full of church leaders, clergy, and scholars, and that a Christian by the name of Kadak was his grand vizier. Under Koyuk, the massacres and devastations which had characterized the rules of Genghis and Ogotai seemed to have come to an immediate end. It is a question if Europe was not spared further Mongolian wrath because a Christian, such as Koyuk, was elected to supreme command. After the death of Koyuk in 1251, the succession passed to Mangu. Tul, a brother of Ogotai, was a mighty general. Of Sarkuti, Bagi, wife of Tul, Mingyana shows that she was another Christian queen, a true believer and the wisest of all. She was the mother of the 3 sons who in turn became vested with imperial dignity, and all of them were professed Christians or possessed of Christian wives. Their names were Mangu, Hulagu, and Kublai. The thrilling story of their contributions to the Church of the East belongs to the history of China in a later chapter. When the sword of destruction hung over Germany, Italy, and France, and England through the menacing attitude of Ogotai's skillful generals, the Pope decided to send an envoy to the relentless Batu, the leader of the Tartar armies. Friar John of Plano Carpini was chosen for this task. He journeyed to the banks of the Dnieper, where the Tartar legions were encamped, encountering many difficulties on the way. Receiving scant attention, he was hurried on to the Volga, the headquarters of Batu. But Batu was unwilling to handle the proposition, and the wiry friar had to proceed by forced marches to the central camp further still east. He arrived after the death of Ogotai and before the election of the new emperor. Some years after the journey of Friar John, King Louis X of France commissioned Friar William of Rubruck to proceed to the central camp of the Mongolians, hoping that he might convert the emperor to the Roman faith. Friar William reports that many items about the Assyrian Christians. What interested one most is what Friar William of Rubruck said of the Assyrian Christians, called by him Nestorians, whom he encountered on his visits to those realms. He found them all in nearly all countries which he had traversed. He met with them in the country of Karakahata, where he noticed that the Turkish people, called Mohammedan, had as king a Nestorian. The Nestorians, he said, were in those parts inhabited by the Turkomans. They conducted their services in the latter's language and wrote books in their alphabet. All in their towns was found a mixture of Nestorians. He relates that in 15 cities of Cathay there were Nestorians possessing an episcopal see. Grand Secretary of the Emperor Mangu, Bulgai by name, was a Nestorian, whose advice was nearly always followed and who was the imperial interpreter. Doctrines of the Christian Mongols. The long and predominating favor with which the Mongol leaders had treated the Church of the East indicates that the doctrine of the Christian Mongols were those of the Assyrian Church. This will appear to be more the case when later histories of this remarkable people were considered. The beginning of their power, however, is connected with a significant fact from which the conclusions can be drawn respecting the type of Christianity they fell in during the first years of their dominion. Again, we consider that celebrated personage, Presbyter John. The name Presbyter John is connected with the Great Revolution which took place in the Asiatic Tartary about 1000. Many writers of sincerity who are worthy of credit relate that a king of the Karaites had been converted to Christ. He had taken the name of John, and he with thousands of his people were baptized by the Church of the East. His empire grew. Each successive ruler was also called John. After about 2 centuries, Genghis Khan conquered the last king. Since the victorious Mongol chieftain married the daughter of the slain priest king, the doctrine of the Church and the East rose to great influence among the Mongols. Moshim says that Europe was deeply stirred at the report concerning the wealth, strength, and happiness of this Christian realm. The king of Portugal sent an embassy to the Abyssinia because he concluded that the doctrines of John were those of the Abyssinians. The legation discovered many things among the Abyssinians that were also analogous to those reported of the Presbyter John. The Church of the East in its wide extent of missions. The organization of the Oriental believers is equally as interesting as the stirring events in the midst of which they labored. From the days of Timothy, the believers in all Asia had been divided by the Church into 26 to 30 grand divisions. Over each of these there was the metropolitan or presiding officer. From time to time, possibly annually, these clergy assembled under their sub-province president to report the condition of the faithful in their parishes and to consider with one another the problems with which they were similarly confronted. Then, occasionally, there would be a large convention under the chairmanship of the metropolitan with delegates from different provinces. When the distances were too great to communicate easily with the Catholicos, the head at Baghdad, then the metropolitan was expected to hand in a report at least once every 6 years. An account has already been given of the purity of the doctrine and of the practice of the Church of the East, which is often wrongly styled Nestorian after Nestorius. McClintock and Strong regards them as the Protestants of Eastern Christianity. The Church of St. Thomas in East India are a branch of the Nestorians. They are named after the Apostle Thomas, who is supposed to have preached the gospel in that country. They were entirely separated from the Church at Rome. Edward Gibbon shows that the St. Thomas Christians, as well as the Syrian Christians, were not connected with Rome in any way. He says that when the Portuguese, in their first discoveries of India, presented the image of the Virgin Mary to the St. Thomas Christians in the 16th century, they said, "We are Christians, not idolaters." Here is a list of those doctrines of that brand of the Assyrian Christians in India, which is called the St. Thomas Christians. Those believers, 1. Condemned the Pope's supremacy. 2. Affirmed that the Roman Catholic Church had departed from the faith. 3. Denied transubstantiation. 4. Condemned the worship of images. 5. Made no use of oils. 6. Denied purgatory. 7. Would not admit a spiritual affinity. 8. Knew nothing of auricular confessions. 9. Had never heard of extreme unction. 10. Permitted the clergy to marry. 11. Denied that matrimony and consecration were sacraments. 12. Celebrated with leavened bread and consecrated with prayer. The remarkable fact is that in the face of the titanic difficulties, the Church of the East was able to maintain through the ages such wonderful unity of belief and soundness of biblical living. In the first place, says Etheridge, speaking of the one branch of the Church of East, the Nestorian Church has always and cherished a remarkable veneration for the Holy Scriptures. Their rule of faith has been, and is, the written Word of God. Widespread and enduring was the observance of the Seventh-day Sabbath among the believers of the Church of the East and the St. Thomas Christians of India who never were connected with Rome. It was also maintained among those bodies which broke off from Rome after the Council of Chalcedon, namely the Abyssinians, the Jacobites, the Maronites, the Armenians. The numbers sanctifying Sabbath varied in these bodies. Some endured longer than others. Noted church historians writing of the Nestorians in Kurdistan say, "The Nestorian fasts are very numerous, meat being forbidden on 152 days. They eat no pork. They keep both the Sabbath and Sunday. They believe neither in auricular confession nor in purgatory, and permit their priests to marry." Sabbath keeping among the Abyssinians is especially worthy of notice. Of them the historian Gibbon fittingly remarks, "Encompassed on all sides by enemies of their religions, the Ethiopians slept near 1,000 years, forgetful of the world by whom they were forgotten." When in the 16th century Europe again came into contact with the Abyssinians, the seventh-day Sabbath was found to be their weekly day of rest. Sunday was only an assembly day. Sorely pressed by the Mohammedanism, they made the same mistake which was made by St. Thomas Christians of India, in that they appealed for help in 1524 to the Portuguese, the greatest naval power of Europe in that day. The following argument was presented by Portugal by the Abyssinian ambassador when asked why Ethiopia sanctified Sabbath, the seventh day. On the Sabbath day, because God, after he had finished the work of creation of the world, rested thereon, which day, as God would have it called the holiest of holies, so not was celebrating thereof with great honor and devotion, seems to be plainly contrary to God's will and precept, who will suffer heaven and earth to pass away sooner than his word, and that especially since Christ came not to dissolve the law, but to fulfill it, it is not therefore in imitation of the Jews, but in obedience to Christ and his holy apostles, that we observe the day. We do observe the Lord's day after the manner of other Christians, in memory of the Christ's resurrection. When the Portuguese made a gesture of sending help to the Abyssinians, a number of Jesuits were included in the mission. They immediately began to win the Abyssinian church to the Roman Catholicism. In 1604, they influenced the king to submit to the papacy. One of their first efforts was to have a proclamation issued by the king prohibiting all of his subjects on severe penalties to observe the seventh-day Sabbath any longer. Civil war followed. The Jesuits were expelled and their laws were rescinded. With respect to the Jacobites, there is the statement of that well-known and learned Samuel Pachas, who, having visited them in the beginning of the 17th century, writes, "They keep Saturday holy, nor esteem Sunday, fast lawful but on Easter even. They have solemn service on Saturdays." Another authority, Josephus Abundagnus, writing on the 18th century in his history of the Jacobites, stated that they assembled every Saturday in their temples, to which statement the latter editor, J. Nicolai, adds the following footnote. Our author states that the Jacobites assembled on the Sabbath day before the Dominical day in the temple, and kept that day, as do also the Abyssinians, as we have seen from the confession of their faith by the Ethiopian king Claudius. And from this it appears that the Jacobites have kept the Sabbath as well as the Dominical day, and still continue in keeping it. Alexander Ross writes that the Marconites likewise observed the Sabbath as well as Sunday. Thus, we see how these four Eastern communities, three of which never walked with the papacy, continued to honor the Sabbath. As one looks upon approximately 5 centuries of Mohammedan rule in Asia, three things are worthy of notice. In the first place, the comparatively tolerant attitude of the rulers is comforting. This is not to say that at times there were not periods of persecution and fierce opposition. However, one does not witness a persistent, determined purpose to root out Christianity by cruel, bloody wantonness. The supreme motive of the Moslem conqueror was the lust of power rather than a fanatical passion to kill and ruin other faiths. The leaders of Islam were so continuously occupied by war among themselves that they had neither the time nor the desire to frame within their own ranks an organization of clergy tied firmly to absolute obedience, as was seen in the papal hierarchy. Dynasties rose and fell, but the Church of the East grew and extended its missions over all the lands of Asia. Secondly, one is surprised by the splendid balanced organization which energizes the Church of the East. Rejecting the polygamy of the Muslims, it was not distracted by domestic broils. This same church refused to emphasize an unmarried life for its clergy, the rule of which prevailed in Buddhism and in Western Romanism. As marriage was designed of God not only to increase love, but to purify love, the Church of the East was safeguarded against such degradations as standards was seen in the Buddhist priests and nuns. Their thoughts ever turned towards their Sabbath home, dearer to them than any palace halls. In other words, they obeyed the four divine policies laid down in the first chapter of Genesis, namely worship of the Creator, Sabbath observance, family life, and proper diet and temperance. Lastly, the members of the Church of the East were not only a church but of evangelical activities, but also a people of sound doctrines. It is difficult to say which is the more dangerous. Sound doctrines without evangelism, or evangelism without sound doctrine. The first leads to coldness in religion. The second produces a vaudeville in preaching. Both these extremes were avoided by the Church of the East. It was able to get a reason for their faith, and at the same time it displayed a life of missionary zeal and sacrifice which has seldom been surpassed.